My stepdaughter looked at me in the eye and said the greatest gift for her wedding would be if I did not come. She told me I was not her real dad. I was just Robert, the man who wrote the checks. My wife sat right there next to her and stayed silent. She did not defend me. She did not say a word. So I did exactly what they asked. I disappeared, but before I left, I made sure I took everything that belonged to me. After selling the house they were sleeping in and canceling every single wedding vendor, the only thing I left in the empty kitchen was a folding chair and a receipt for $0. It was the shock of their lives. Before I tell you how I dismantled their world in 72 hours, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you believe that loyalty is expensive and betrayal should never be free. My name is Robert Sullivan. I am 68 years old, and for the last 15 years, I have been the silent engine keeping a luxury lifestyle afloat for people who secretly despised me. I spent my life looking at spreadsheets, calculating risks as a chief financial officer for a Fortune 500 company. I know how to spot a bad investment. I just never realized the worst investment of my life was sleeping in the master bedroom and living in the guest room down the hall. Last Friday night was supposed to be a celebration. We were at L'Ernardon, one of the most expensive seafood restaurants in Manhattan. The lighting was dim, the tablecloths were crisp white, and the air smelled of old money and quiet judgment. I was sitting across from my wife, Patricia, and her 26-year-old daughter, Madison. Madison was glowing. She had that influencer shine, the kind that comes from weekly facials and a life free of manual labor. She was scrolling through her phone, probably checking the engagement on her latest post about wedding stress. I sat there sipping my sparkling water, waiting. The waiter placed the bill on the table. It was heavy-bound in leather. Without looking up, Madison slid a cream-colored envelope across the table toward me. It was the official wedding invitation. The paper was thick hand-pressed cotton with gold leaf lettering. I knew the texture well because I was the one who paid $5. Zuzos in for the printing. I opened it expecting to see my name listed as the host. Traditionally, the father of the bride, or in this case, the stepfather who paid for everything, is listed at the top. I scanned the elegant script. Mr. and Mrs. Gary Miller request the honor of your presence at the marriage of their daughter Madison. I froze. Gary Miller, her biological father. The man who had not paid a dime in child support since 1998. The man who showed up once a year with a hangover and a cheap toy, then disappeared when the rent was due. My name was nowhere on the invitation. I looked up at Madison. She was not looking at me. She was using her butter knife to dissect a scallop. Madison, I said, keeping my voice low, I think there is a misprint. My name is missing. She finally looked up. Her eyes were the same shade of blue as her mother's, and they held the same capacity for cruelty. It is not a mistake, Robert. We talked about it. Gary is walking me down the aisle. I felt a cold pressure in my chest. I placed the invitation down. But Gary is not hosting this wedding, I am. I have already put down $80,000 in deposits. The venue, the flowers, the catering. Gary has not contributed a cent. Madison sighed the kind of dramatic sigh she used when a waiter brought her tap water instead of bottled. Please do not make this about money, Robert. You always make it about money. This is about aesthetics. About Gary is my real dad. He has that rugged artistic look. It fits the vintage vineyard vibe we are going for. You have to admit you are a bit corporate. You look stiff in photos. We want the pictures to be perfect for Vogue. I looked at Patricia, my wife of 15 years. The woman I had taken on cruises to the Mediterranean. The woman whose debts I cleared when we got married. Surely she would speak up. Surely she would say, Madison, that is incredibly disrespectful to the man who paid for your teeth to be straightened and your degree from NYU. I waited. Patricia took a sip of her Chardonnay. She dabbed her lips with the napkin and avoided my eyes. Honey, she said softly to me, not to Madison. It is her special day. We just want her to be happy. Gary is family. You know how sensitive he is about his status. We do not want him to feel excluded. Excluded, the word hung in the air. The man who abandoned them was family. The man who paid the mortgage was an accessory that did not match the decor. I looked down at the leather bill folder. $800 for a dinner where I was told I was not photogenic enough to be a father. I did not yell. I did not flip the table. Years in the corporate boardroom had taught me that when you are emotional, you lose leverage. I pulled out my American Express black card. The heavy metal card clinked against the china. I understand, I said. I want the photos to be perfect, too. Madison clapped her hands together. Thank you, Robert. I knew you would get it. Oh, and since you are being so understanding, Tyler and I were thinking about upgrading the champagne toast to Dom Perignon. It is only an extra $4,000. I looked at her smile. I saw the braces I paid for. I saw the dermatology appointments I covered. I saw the entitlement that I had watered and fertilized for a decade and a half. Order whatever you want, I said. The ride back to Connecticut was silent. The interior of my Mercedes was soundproof, sealing us in with the tension. I drove. I always drove. Patricia sat in the passenger seat, scrolling through her iPad. Madison was in the back texting her fiancé, Tyler. I watched the city lights fade into the darkness of the highway. My mind was racing, but my face was stone. I was doing the math, not the math of the wedding budget, but the math of my life. I calculated the years I postponed my retirement to fund their lifestyle. I calculated the investment portfolio I liquidated to buy the house in Greenwich, because Patricia said she needed to be closer to her friends. Patricia cleared her throat. The sound was like nails on a chalkboard in the quiet car. Robert, she said, her voice dripping with that fake sweetness she used when she wanted something. I was thinking, since Gary is walking Madison down the aisle, he needs to look the part. He does not have a proper suit. I'd kept my eyes on the road, and well, she continued, hesitated for a second, then plunged in. You have that beautiful charcoal Armani suit in your closet, the one you wore to the gala last year. You and Gary are about the same size now that he has lost some weight. I was wondering if we could borrow it for him just for the weekend. We do not want him looking shabby next to Madison. I gripped the steering wheel so hard my knuckles turned white. They did not just want to replace me. They wanted to strip me for parts. They wanted to dress the deadbeat dad in my clothes so he could play the role of the successful patriarch. It was almost funny. It was grotesque. I took a breath, a slow, deep breath. If I exploded now, they would paint me as the villain. They would say I was jealous, petty, controlling. I needed to be smarter. I needed to be the ghost they thought I was. Sure, I said. My voice sounded flat, even to my own ears. He can borrow the suit. Really? Patricia sounded surprised. Oh, thank you, honey. You are being so big about this. I know it is awkward, but it means the world to Madison. From the back seat, Madison chirped. Thanks, Robert. You are a lifesaver. Gary is going to look so hot. Hot. She was talking about her father. I felt a wave of nausea. I turned on the radio to drown out their voices. I put on a classical station, letting the violins fill the space. I needed to think. I needed a plan. The wedding was in 3 weeks. The final payments for the venue and the caterer were due in 5 days. That was my window. 5 days to dismantle 15 years of lies. We pulled into the driveway of the colonial house I bought 3 years ago. It was a sprawling estate with white pillars and a manicured lawn that cost more to maintain than most people earned in a year. The porch light was on. It looked like the American dream. Inside, it was a hollow shell. I carried the shopping bags inside. Madison went straight to her room to FaceTime Tyler. Patricia went to the kitchen to pour herself another glass of wine. I told them I had some work to finish in my study. I walked down the hallway to my office. The house was filled with things I had paid for. The Persian rug in the foyer. The abstract painting in the hallway that Madison insisted was an investment. The grand piano that no one played. I felt like a stranger, walking through a museum of my own exploitation. I entered my study and closed the door. This was the only room in the house that felt like mine. It was lined with mahogany bookshelves and smelled of old paper and leather. I sat down at my heavy oak desk. I did not turn on the computer. I just sat there in the dark for a moment listening. I could hear Patricia's voice coming from the kitchen. She must have thought I was out of earshot. Or maybe she just didn't care anymore. She was on the phone. He actually said yes to the suit. Patricia was laughing, a high, tinkling laugh that sounded like breaking glass. I know, right? I thought he would put up a fight, but he is so desperate to be liked. He just rolled over. There was a pause while the person on the other end spoke. I knew instantly who it was, Gary. Yeah, well, he is useful, Patricia continued. We just need to keep him sweet until after the honeymoon expenses are covered. Madison wants to go to the Maldives. It is going to be another 20 grand. Once the wedding is over, we can talk about the house. I think I can convince him to downsize to a condo so we can cash out some equity. You could get that truck you wanted. My blood ran cold. It wasn't just about the wedding. It was a long-term parasitism. They were planning to bleed me dry and then discard the husk. I heard Gary's voice faint and tiny through the speaker phone. What an old fool. Does he suspect anything about the prenup? No, Patricia scoffed. He thinks he is so smart with his finance degree, but he is soft when it comes to family. He sees himself as the savior. It is pathetic, really. He is just an old ATM machine that needs a little oiling now and then. An old ATM machine. That was it. That was the sentence that severed the last thread of affection I held for these people. The anger that had been simmering in my gut flash-boiled into something else, something colder, something lethal. I stood up and walked to the painting behind my desk. I swung it aside to reveal the wall safe. I spun the dial, left to 32, right to 15, left to 8. The heavy steel door clicked open. Inside were stacks of documents, passports, and backup hard drives. I reached for a blue folder at the bottom. It was labeled premarital assets and estate planning. I pulled it out and laid it on the desk. I turned on the green banker's lamp. The light pulled on the documents. I opened the folder. Right on top was the deed to the house. I ran my finger over the legal description. Purchased by Robert Sullivan's sole owner. Because Patricia had credit issues from her first marriage to Gary, her name was never on the deed. We had signed a prenup that stated any asset acquired with funds from my pre-retirement accounts remained sole property. I looked at the next document, the Revocable Living Trust. It controlled the access to the accounts Patricia used for her daily spending. I looked at the wedding vendor contracts. Every single one of them was signed by me. Not Madison, not Tyler. Me. I was not just the ATM. I was the bank owner, and the bank was about to close. I checked the time. It was 11:30 p.m. on a Friday. Most people would wait until Monday to call their lawyer. I was not most people. I picked up my phone and dialed a number I had not called in years. It rang twice. Sullivan, a voice rasped. It was late, but Arthur Blackwood never slept. He was the kind of lawyer you hired when you wanted to scorch the earth. Arthur, I said, I apologize for the late hour. You are the only client who apologizes. Arthur grunted. What is wrong? You sound like you are staring at a dead body. Not yet, I said, looking at the photo of Patricia and me on my desk. I knocked the frame face down. But I need to liquidate a property fast. I need a cash buyer closed in 7 days. Which property? Arthur asked. The house I am standing in, I said. There was a silence on the other line. Then Arthur chuckled a dry, dusty sound. The Greenwich estate. Patricia is not going to like that. Patricia is not going to know, I said. Not until the locks are changed. And Arthur, I need to cancel some checks. A lot of checks. I heard the sound of a lighter clicking and a deep inhale. Start talking, Robert. I have a pen. For the next hour, I laid out the architecture of their destruction. I did not raise my voice. I did not cry. I simply moved assets from column A to column B. I instructed Arthur to trigger the penalty clauses in the wedding contracts. I authorized the immediate sale of the house to a holding company that specialized in distress purchases. They would buy it for 20% under market value if they could take possession in 48 hours. I told them to take the deal. I did not care about the loss. I would have burned the house down if it wasn't illegal. Losing money was acceptable. Losing my dignity was not. When I hung up the phone, the house was quiet. Patricia and Madison were asleep upstairs, dreaming of Armani suits and Maldives beaches. They had no idea that the roof over their heads was already sold. They had no idea that the credit cards in their wallets were already dead plastic. I walked to the window and looked out at the swimming pool glowing blue in the moonlight. I remembered teaching Madison how to swim in that pool. I remembered holding her when she cried after her first heartbreak. I remembered paying off Gary's gambling debts so he wouldn't go to jail, just so Madison wouldn't have a felon for a father. I had been a good man. I had been a generous man. But tonight, Robert, the father, died. Robert, the CFO, was back in charge, and the audit was going to be brutal. I went back to the safe and pulled out one last thing. It was a velvet box containing a diamond necklace I had bought for Madison as a wedding gift. It was worth $15,000. I looked at it for a moment, the diamonds sparkling under the lamp. Then I dropped it into the trash can next to my desk. I turned off the light and walked out of the study. I climbed the stairs to the master bedroom. Patricia was sleeping soundly, her breathing deep and even. I lay down on my side of the bed, the side I paid for. I stared at the ceiling. Tomorrow the real show would begin. I would play the part of the obedient, beaten-down stepfather for exactly 48 more hours. I would smile. I would nod. I would let them think they had won. I would let them inflate the balloon of their arrogance until it was ready to burst. And then I would bring the needle. As I closed my eyes, I thought about the invite again. Mr. and Mrs. Gary Miller, I whispered into the darkness. Good luck paying the bill, Gary. The next morning, the sun hit the breakfast nook with that aggressive cheerfulness that only happens when your life is falling apart. Madison was already at the table, surrounded by bridal magazines. She was circling flower arrangements with a red marker. Patricia was making smoothies, the blender whirring loudly, drowning out any need for conversation. Morning, Robert, Patricia shouted over the noise. She poured a green sludge into a glass and set it in front of me. Drink up. You looked a little tired last night. We have a big day. The florist appointment is at 10:00, and then we need to go to the tailor for Gary's fitting. I looked at the smoothie, kale and ginger, the taste of penance. I took a sip. Actually, I said, setting the glass down. I was thinking we should expand the flower budget. Madison's head snapped up. Her eyes went wide. Really? I nodded, keeping my face completely neutral. I was thinking about what you said last night, about the aesthetics. If Gary is walking you down the aisle, we need the path to be spectacular. Maybe those imported orchids you liked. The ones from Thailand. Madison squealed. She actually squealed. Oh my God, Robert, those are like triple the price. Does it matter? I asked. Spreading cream cheese on a bagel. You only get married once. Let's make it Vogue-worthy. Patricia beamed at me. She walked over and kissed the top of my head. See, I told you he would come around. He just needed a good night's sleep. I smiled. It was a tight, thin smile, but they were too absorbed in their greed to notice the difference. Call the florist, I said. Tell them to double the order and put it on my tab. I watched Madison scramble for her phone, her fingers flying across the screen. She was texting Tyler, probably telling him that the old ATM was dispensing cash again. While she was distracted, my phone vibrated in my pocket. It was a text from Arthur Blackwood. House sale contracts ready. The buyer wired the funds. Escrow closes Monday morning. You have 48 hours to vacate. I felt a surge of adrenaline. It was done. The clock was ticking. We spent the day hemorrhaging money. At the florist, I approved a $20,000 archway. At the tailor, I paid for expedited alterations on my own suit so it would fit Gary's beer gut. I stood there in the fitting room, watching the tailor pin the fabric of my Italian wool suit around the man who had slept with my wife while I was at work 20 years ago. Gary was pining in the mirror. Not bad, Bob, he said, looking at my reflection. You have good taste. Little tight in the shoulders, but I make it work. You certainly do, I said. He turned to me, lowering his voice. Hey, about the bachelor party. Tyler and I were thinking Vegas. Just a quick weekend. We might need a little injection of funds, to do it right. I looked at him. This man had no shame. It was a bottomless pit of need. Send me the itinerary, I said. I will take care of it. Gary clapped me on the back. You're a good sport, Bob. I don't care what Patty says about you being a boor. You're all right. I mentally added Vegas trip to the list of things I would cancel on Monday. The weekend was a blur of spending. I became the yes man they had always wanted. I approved the premium open bar. I approved the live string quartet. I approved the fireworks display. With every yes, I saw Madison's respect for me diminish. To her, I wasn't a father being generous. I was a servant knowing his place. By Sunday night, the estimated cost of the wedding had ballooned to $150,000. Madison was ecstatic. Patricia was smug. Gary was drunk on my scotch. I went to my study and printed out a single document. It was the confirmation of the cancellation of all credit cards, effective Monday at 9 a.m. I placed it in my briefcase next to the house sale papers. Monday morning arrived with gray skies. I dressed in my work clothes even though I was retired. Old habits. "Where are you going?" Patricia asked from the bed. She was wearing a silk eye mask. "Meeting with the financial planner." I lied effortlessly. "Just moving some funds around to cover the wedding checks." "Good," she mumbled, rolling over. "Make sure you transfer enough for the honeymoon, too." I walked downstairs. The house was silent. I looked at the living room one last time. I looked at the spot on the rug where I had played horsey with Madison when she was 10. I felt a pang of sadness, sharp and sudden. It didn't have to be this way. If they had shown me 1 ounce of gratitude, if they had just invited me to the wedding as a father. But they didn't. I walked out the front door and locked it. I keyed in the code to the lockbox I had installed on the porch railing earlier that morning. I placed the house key inside. I walked to my car. I did not look back. I drove to a coffee shop in town and ordered a black coffee. I sat by the window and waited. At 9 a.m. my phone buzzed. It was a notification from the bank. All accounts frozen. Authorized user cards declined. At 9:15 a.m. the first text came. It was from Dad. "I'm at the spa. My car just got declined. It's embarrassing. Can you fix it?" I did not reply. At 9:30 a.m. the real estate agent called. "The moving crew is at the house, Mr. Sullivan. They are asking if the residents are ready to leave." I took a sip of my coffee. "Proceed," I said. I could only imagine the scene, real Patricia waking up to burly men packing her life into boxes. The confusion, the screaming, the realization that the ground had vanished beneath her feet. At 10 a.m. my phone began to ring. Patricia, Madison, Gary, Tyler, the florist, the caterer, the wedding planner. I watched the screen light up name after name. I felt a strange sense of peace. The silence of the car ride on Friday had been oppressive, but this silence, the silence of not answering, it was the most beautiful sound I had ever heard. I let it ring. I had a busy day ahead. I had a flight to catch. But first, I had one last stop to make. I needed to leave them a parting gift. I drove back to the house one last time. The moving trucks were already filling up. Patricia was on the front lawn wearing her bathrobe, screaming at a man with a clipboard. She looked wild, desperate. I parked down the street and watched. She spotted my car. She started running towards me, her face twisted in rage. "Robert," she screamed, "what have you done?" I rolled up the window and drove away. This is the end of Chapter 1. The bomb has been dropped. The explosion has just begun. If you want to see how they try to fight back, and how I crush their counterattack, with nothing but the law and the truth, hit that subscribe button. You do not want to miss the fallout. The weekend became a masterclass in psychological warfare. I had spent 40 years in finance learning how to spot a bubble, how to identify when a market was inflated by hype and greed before the inevitable crash. Now I was not just spotting the bubble. I was the one pumping the air into it. I watched them with a detached clinical curiosity as their appetites grew to match the imaginary budget I had laid out for them. Saturday morning started at the Floral Design Studio in downtown Greenwich. The air inside was thick with the scent of lilies and eucalyptus, a smell that usually reminded me of funerals. Madison was sitting across from the lead designer, a woman named Celine, who had dollar signs in her eyes the moment she saw my watch. Madison was holding a sample bouquet of white roses. It was tasteful. It was modest. It was affordable. "It is nice," Madison said, but her voice lacked conviction. She looked at the price sheet and bit her lip. "The total is already at $8,000. Robert, are you sure we can go higher? I sat back in the velvet chair, crossing my legs. I looked at Tyler, her fiancé. He was scrolling through his phone, likely checking his fantasy football stats, completely disengaged from the financial burden he was about to assume. Enter Madison, I said, my voice smooth and reassuring. Do not look at the price tag. Look at the legacy. These photos will last forever. Do you want to look back at your wedding album and see budget roses? Or do you want to see a cascading waterfall of orchids that screams royalty? Madison's eyes lit up. She looked at Celine. Show us the orchids. Celine beamed. She pulled out a new portfolio. The designs were extravagant. Arches made of imported white Phalaenopsis orchids. Centerpieces that required structural engineering to stand upright. A flower wall for the Instagram station. The estimate came back at $28,000. Tyler finally looked up from his phone. Whoa, that is the price of a car. I leaned forward, locking eyes with the young man who had never held a steady job for more than 6 months. Tyler, I said, it is an investment in your image, and do not worry about the cash flow. I have already initiated a transfer from my brokerage account. It just takes a few business days to clear. Tyler relaxed. Oh, okay, cool. Then came the trap. I patted my pockets, finding annoyance. Damn, I said. I left my wallet in the other jacket. Tyler, you have your credit card right. Put the deposit down. It is just $5,000 to hold the date. I will write you a check for the full amount on Monday morning when the markets open. Plus, think of the points. You could probably get a free flight out of this transaction alone. Greed is a powerful anesthetic. It numbs the survival instinct. Tyler looked at Madison. She nodded encouragingly. He pulled out his credit card. It was a card with a high limit that his parents had co-signed for. He handed it to Celine with a trembling hand. Put it on the card, he said, trying to sound like a big shot. I watched the machine beep, approved. The trap was set. The contract was in Tyler's name. The liability was his. The promise of reimbursement was just air. We moved from the florist to the caterer. This was supposed to be a simple tasting, but I had other plans. The original menu was chicken cordon bleu. Safe, boring, cheap. Gary met us there. He was wearing a polo shirt that was too tight, looking like he had just rolled out of bed. He sat at the head of the table as if he were paying the bill. The chicken is dry, Gary announced, tossing his fork onto the plate. If I am walking my girl down the aisle, we cannot serve dry chicken. It reflects poorly on the family. I suppressed a laugh. The only thing reflecting poorly on this family was the man sitting at the head of the table, but I nodded in agreement. Gary is right, I said. This is a celebration. We need something that makes a statement. I signaled the chef. Bring out the surf and turf option, the Maine lobster, and the filet mignon. Patricia's eyes widened. Robert, that adds another $100 per head. We have 200 guests. I reached over and squeezed her hand. My touch was cold, but she interpreted it as affection. Patty, I said, I want you to be proud. I want your friends to talk about this wedding for years. Let them have the lobster. The chef brought out the platter. Steamed lobster tails with drawn butter. Steaks seared to perfection. Gary tore into a lobster tail with his bare hands, butter dripping down his chin. Now this, Gary mumbled with a mouthful of food. This is class. Good call, Bob. I watched the meat. I watched Madison take a selfie with the lobster. I watched Tyler calculate the points he would get on his credit card. Because once again, when the bill for the upgrade deposit came, I insisted they put it on their cards. It builds your credit history, I told them. It looks great for mortgage applications when you show you can pay off large balances. I will clear it all on Monday. They signed. They ate. They laughed. They were feasting on their own future bankruptcy. By Sunday afternoon, the bubble was enormous. We had upgraded the bar to the premium platinum package. We had hired a 12-piece jazz orchestra instead of a DJ. We had booked a vintage Rolls-Royce for the getaway car. Every single contract was signed by Madison or Tyler. Every single deposit was paid with their credit cards or the emergency savings account Tyler's parents had given him for a house down payment. Total estimated debt they had accrued in 48 hours, $65,000. Sunday night, we gathered in the living room. The mood was electric. Madison was high on the adrenaline of spending. Patricia was looking at me with a newfound respect, or perhaps just satisfaction that I had finally learned my place as the financier. Gary was there too, of course. He was drinking my 20-year-old scotch, reclining in my leather armchair. To the happy couple, Gary toasted, raising his glass. And to me, for making such beautiful children, Patricia giggled. And to Robert, she added as an afterthought, for being so supportive. I raised my glass of water to Monday. I said they thought I was toasting the day I would transfer the money. They had no idea I was toasting their execution. Later that night, I went to my study. I needed to make sure the timeline was perfect. The house sale would close at 9 a.m. The movers were scheduled for 10 a.m. My flight to Italy was at 2 p.m. I sat at my desk and looked at the stack of receipts Madison had proudly handed me. She wanted me to have them, so I knew exactly how much to write the check for. I picked up my checkbook. I uncapped my fountain pen. The ink was black, permanent. I wrote the date. Monday, I wrote the pay. Madison Miller, I wrote the amount. Then I stopped. I looked at the check. It was a beautiful piece of paper. It represented safety. It represented a father's love. I ripped it out of the book. I tore it in half. Then I tore it again and again until it was just confetti. I dropped the pieces into the wastebasket. There would be no check. There would be no transfer. There would be no rescue. I walked to the window and looked out at the driveway. Tyler's car was parked next to Madison's. They were staying the night. They wanted to be close to the bank in the morning. They were sleeping in a house that didn't belong to them anymore. They were spending money that didn't exist. They were planning a future on a foundation of sand, and the tide was coming in fast. I went upstairs to the guest room. I had moved my things in there quietly throughout the day. My suitcases were packed and hidden in the closet. My passport was in my jacket pocket. I lay down on the single bed. It was uncomfortable, but it felt better than the king-sized bed in the master suite. That bed was full of lies. This bed was honest. I closed my eyes and listened to the silence of the house. It was the calm before the storm. In a few hours, the sun would rise on a new reality. I fell asleep, dreaming of lobster shells and withered orchids. When I woke up, the digital clock read 5 a.m. It was Monday. I got up, showered, and dressed in my travel clothes. I moved silently through the house. I could hear Gary snoring from the living room sofa. He had passed out there last night. I walked into the kitchen. The granite countertops were cold. This was the stage for the final act. I pulled the envelope from my jacket. Inside was the letter I had written, the eviction notice from the new owners, and the cancellation receipts for the few things that were actually in my name. I placed the envelope in the center of the kitchen island. I pulled up a single folding chair and placed it facing the envelope. It looked like an art installation, a monument to consequences. I checked my watch. 5:30 a.m. The moving crew for the heavy furniture, the things I was selling, not keeping, would be here in 4 hours. But I would be gone by then. I picked up my suitcase. I walked to the back door. I paused and looked at the family photos on the wall. Madison's graduation, Patricia and me in Hawaii. Gary holding a beer at a barbecue. I took them all down. I did not want them. I stacked them on the floor face down. I opened the door and stepped out into the cool morning air. The sun was just starting to bleed over the horizon, painting the sky in shades of bruised purple and angry orange. I got into my car. I started the engine. I looked at the house one last time. "Goodbye," I whispered. I put the car in gear and drove away. The bubble was full. It was floating high in the sky, shimmering and beautiful, and I had just let go of the string. While Madison and Tyler were busy burning through their credit limits on lobster and imported orchids, I was sitting in a booth at the back of a 24-hour diner, 3 towns over. The vinyl seat was cracked, and the air smelled of burnt coffee, a stark contrast to the luxury I had just left behind. But this was where business was done when you did not want to be seen. Across from me sat a man who looked like a shark in a cheap suit. His name was Mr. Kane, a representative for a private equity firm that specialized in distressed assets. They bought homes for cash, no questions asked, as long as the price was right and the closing was immediate. On the table between us lay a thick stack of documents, the deed to my house in Greenwich, the appraisal report from last year valuing the property at $2.8 million, and the contract Mr. Kane had just slid over to me. I put on my reading glasses and looked at the number on the bottom line. $2.1 million. It was a lowball offer, an insulting figure that would make any real estate agent scream. I was losing $700,000 in equity instantly, a loss of 25%. In my former life as a CFO, I would have fired anyone who brought me a deal this bad. But today I was not looking for profit. I was looking for speed. I was buying a weapon, and weapons are expensive. I looked at Mr. Kane. He was watching me tapping a gold pen against his chin, expecting me to negotiate. He thought I was desperate. He thought I was in debt. He had no idea I was simply a man who was done waiting. "The price is acceptable," I said, my voice steady. Kane stopped tapping. He blinked, surprised. "Just like that. You know the market is hot, Mr. Sullivan. You could get more if you listed it properly." "I do not have time for open houses," I replied. "I do not have time for inspections or mortgage contingencies. I need the funds wired to my offshore account by tomorrow morning, and I need the title transferred immediately." "But there is one condition," Kane leaned in. "There is always a catch." "What is it? Is the foundation cracking? Is there mold?" "The house is pristine," I said. "I just put on a new slate roof last year. The condition is simple. I need a lease back for exactly 7 days. I will pay rent for the week, but on the 8th day at 900 a.m. sharp, you take possession, you change the locks, you bring the eviction crew if necessary." Kane smiled a predatory grin that showed too many teeth. "We can do that. We are used to handling sensitive exits. But what about the other occupants? Public records show you are married. Does your wife know you are selling the roof over her head for 7 cents on the dollar?" I reached into my briefcase and pulled out the document that was the cornerstone of my entire plan. It was not the deed. It was something far more personal, a post-nuptial agreement dated 5 years ago. I slid it across the table. "My wife has no claim to this property," I said. This was the secret weapon Patricia had conveniently forgotten about. 5 years ago, my wife had a secret of her own. She had developed a gambling habit. It started with bingo, then moved to slot machines, and finally ended in the high-stakes rooms of Atlantic City. I found out when a man with a broken nose showed up at my office demanding $150,000 that Patricia had borrowed against her jewelry. She was terrified. She was weeping on the floor of our living room, begging me to save her, promising she would never do it again. I saved her. I paid the debt. I made the problem go away. But I am a businessman. I do not give away money without securing collateral. I told her I would pay off her mistakes, but she had to sign a post-nuptial agreement. It stated clearly that in exchange for my financial bailout, she waived all rights to my premarital assets, specifically the Greenwich estate and my retirement accounts. She signed it without reading it. She was so desperate to escape the consequences of her gambling that she would have signed her soul away. She probably thought I would never use it. She probably thought I was too soft, too in love, too weak to ever enforce a contract against the woman I slept next to. She was wrong. Mr. Kane flipped through the legal pages. He read the waiver clause. He whistled low and impressed. "Ironclad," he said. "You really tied her hands." "I did not tie her hands," I said, taking the document back. "I just refused to be the one who drowned with her." I picked up the pen. The ink flowed smoothly onto the paper. Robert Sullivan. I signed my name 3 times. With each signature, I felt the weight of the house lifting off my shoulders. The heated pool. The home theater I never used. The wine cellar Gary was currently raiding. It was all gone. It was just bricks and mortar now. I stood up and shook Kane's hand. His palm was sweaty. "Wire the funds," I said, "and have your crew ready for Monday morning. I will leave the keys in the lockbox." When I drove back to the house, it was late afternoon. The sun was casting long shadows across the lawn, making the white pillars look like the bars of a golden cage. I pulled into the driveway and saw Patricia standing by the front door. She was holding fabric swatches up against the exterior brickwork. She waved at me, smiling. She looked happy, safe, secure. "Robert," she called out as I got out of the car. "I was thinking, since we are doing so much for the wedding, maybe next month we should repaint the exterior. This white is getting a little dingy. I was thinking of a soft cream color. It would look so elegant." I walked up the steps. I looked at the house that now belonged to a private equity firm. I looked at the woman who was planning renovations on a property she had been evicted from hours ago. "Cream sounds nice," I said. She hooked her arm through mine. "And Madison was saying we should convert your study into a nursery, eventually, for when she and Tyler decide to have kids. You don't really use it that much, do you? You could move your desk to the basement." The basement. They wanted to put me in the basement of a house I had just sold. The irony was so rich I could taste it. I opened the front door for her. "After you," I said. We walked into the foyer. Gary was there, of course. He was napping on the silk sofa, his feet up on the coffee table wearing my slippers. He opened one eye when we walked in. "Hey, Bob," he grunted. "We ran out of ice. Be a pal and grab a bag from the store." I looked at him. I looked at the ring of water damage his glass was leaving on the antique table. A normal man would have screamed. A normal man would have thrown him out. But I was in the end game now. Every insult was just fuel. Every slight was just validation that I had done the right thing at that diner. "Sure, Gary," I said. "I will get the ice." I went to the kitchen, but I did not get ice. I went to the calendar on the refrigerator. Patricia had marked the wedding date in red heart stickers. I took a black marker from the drawer. I drew a small, inconspicuous X on the Monday following the wedding. "What's that?" Madison asked, walking in with a glass of wine. "What's happening on Monday?" I capped the marker. "Just a deadline," I said. "A business deadline." "Nothing you need to worry about." She rolled her eyes. "You are always working, Robert. You need to learn to live a little. Like Gary, he knows how to relax." I smiled at my stepdaughter, the girl whose tuition I paid. The girl whose car insurance I covered. The girl who was about to learn the hardest lesson of her life. "You are right, Madison," I said softly. "I am going to learn to relax, starting very soon." I walked out of the kitchen, leaving them to their wine and their delusions. I had 7 days left in this house. 7 days to pack my life into boxes while they planned a party. 7 days to watch them walk toward the cliff edge, smiling the whole way. I went upstairs to my study, the room they wanted to turn into a nursery, and closed the door. I sat in the chair and listened to the silence. It wasn't the silence of loneliness anymore. It was the silence of a countdown, and the clock was ticking loud and clear. Tick-tock, tick-tock. The house was sold. The trap was set. Now I just had to wait for the snap. The clock on the wall of my study ticked past 4 in the afternoon. The sunlight was beginning to slant through the blinds, cutting the room into strips of light and shadow. I sat in my leather chair, the one I had bought after my first big promotion 20 years ago, and waited. The house was quiet, but it was a deceptive quiet. It was the silence of a trap waiting to be sprung. On the desk in front of me lay the charcoal gray Armani suit. It was freshly dry clean-aimed, wrapped in plastic, looking like a body bag for a ghost. I heard the front door open without a knock. That was Gary. He never knocked anymore. Since Friday, since the moment Madison had declared him the father of the bride, he had been walking into my home as if he held the deed. I heard his heavy footsteps on the hardwood floor, the scuff of cheap rubber soles against the expensive oak planks. He was whistling. It was a tune I did not recognize, but it sounded arrogant. "Hey, Bob," he called out. His voice echoed in the hallway. "You in the dungeon?" I did not answer. I just watched the door. A moment later, Gary appeared in the frame. He looked disheveled as always. His hair was thinning, combed over in a desperate attempt to hide the scalp, and his face carried the redness of a man who drank his breakfast. He was wearing jeans that were too tight and a faded t-shirt that said legend across the chest. The irony was almost too much to bear. "There he is," Gary said, grinning. He walked into the room and looked around. "Man, I love this room. Smells like money. Smells like old books and seriousness. When I move in for a few weeks after you guys go on that trip, I think I am going to make this my command center. Maybe put a mini fridge over there by the window." He pointed to the spot where my limited edition globe stood. I said nothing. I just gestured to the suit on the desk. "It is ready for you, Gary," I said. He walked over and ran his hand over the plastic. "Nice," he whistled. "Italian wool." "The best," I said. He ripped the plastic open with a violence that made me flinch internally. He pulled the jacket off the hanger and held it up. He slipped his arms into it. It was a good fit, unfortunately. We were about the same height, though he carried his weight in his gut while I carried mine in my chest. He buttoned it, struggling slightly with the middle button, sucking in his stomach until the fabric strained. He turned to the mirror in the corner. He pined. He adjusted the lapels. He looked at himself like he was the CEO of the world. "Damn," he said softly. "I clean up good. Look at that, Bob. You can put a suit on a jagged rock and make it look smooth, huh?" "You look appropriate," I said. "Madison will be pleased." Gary turned to face me, leaning against my desk. He crossed his arms. The fabric of my suit stretched across his back. "You know, Bob," he said, his tone shifting from vanity to something sharper, something nastier. "I got to give it to you. You are taking this whole thing better than I thought you would." I looked him in the eye. "I am a pragmatist, Gary. Madison wants her father. Who am I to stand in the way of biology?" Gary laughed. A wet hacking sound. "Biology? Yeah, that is the thing, isn't it? You can buy them the houses, you can buy them the cars, you can pay for the fancy degrees, but at the end of the day, blood calls to blood. You are just the resource. I am the source." He picked up a crystal paperweight from my desk and tossed it casually in the air. "Patty and I were talking last night." He continued watching the glass spin. "She is worried about you. She thinks you are getting too old for this big house. All these stairs, the maintenance, it is a lot for a man in his twilight years." I stayed perfectly still. "Is that so?" "Yeah," Gary said. "We were thinking maybe after the wedding it is time for a change. Sell this place. Use the cash to get you a nice little condo in Florida. Something with a nurse on call. And then, well, the rest of the equity could really help Madison and Tyler get started. And Patty deserves to have some fun, don't you think? She has spent 15 years taking care of you, taking care of me. The woman who had not cooked a meal in a decade. The woman whose gambling debts I had erased." "That is an interesting plan," I said evenly. Gary smirked. He set the paperweight down. "Look, Bob, do not make this hard. You had a good run. You got to play family man. But now the real man is back. I am going to be around a lot more. Holidays, birthdays, Sundays. It is going to be uncomfortable for you. We are just trying to give you a graceful exit." He was evicting me. In my own study, wearing my own suit, the man who had abandoned his daughter was telling me it was time to leave so he could consume the carcass of my life. I stood up. I walked over to him. For a second, I saw fear flicker in his eyes. He remembered that I was a Marine before I was an accountant. He remembered that I knew how to break things. But I did not raise my fist. I reached out and smoothed the lapel of his jacket. "You are right, Gary," I said softly. "I have been thinking the same thing. It is time for a change." I reached into my pocket. "Here," I said, "you will need a pocket square to complete the look." I pulled out a folded white silk handkerchief, but inside the folds, hidden deep within the fabric, was a device no larger than a stick of gum. It was a high-fidelity digital recorder, the kind I used to use for board meetings. It was already recording. It had a battery life of 48 hours and enough memory to capture a week of conversations. I tucked the handkerchief into the breast pocket of the suit. I patted it gently. "Perfect," I said. Gary looked down at the pocket. "Thanks, Bob. You really are a servant at heart, aren't you?" "Always serving the better man." He laughed again and turned back to the mirror. "I am going to keep this on," he said. "Break it in. I am heading over to meet Tyler for drinks. We have some celebrating to do." "By all means," I said. "Enjoy the evening." Gary strutted to the door. He paused with his hand on the frame. "Hey, Bob." "Yes, don't wait up," he sneered. I waited until I heard the front door close. I waited until I heard the engine of his rusted truck cough to life and fade down the driveway. I walked to the window. I watched the dust settle. He was wearing the wire. He was walking into a bar to meet the other leech, Tyler. Alcohol loosens tongues. Arrogance loosens them even faster. In that pocket right next to his beating heart was the evidence I needed to bury them all. He would brag about the plan. He would laugh about how they were manipulating me. He would admit to the coercion, and the judge would hear every single word. I turned back to my desk. The plastic wrap from the suit was still there, crumpled like a shed skin. I picked it up and threw it in the trash. I did not feel angry anymore. The time for anger had passed. Now I just felt the cold, hard clarity of execution. I looked at the empty hanger. It swayed slightly in the air current from the air conditioner. "Wear it in good health, Gary," I whispered to the empty room. "Because it is the last suit you will ever wear as a free man." I sat down and opened my laptop. I had one more transfer to make. I logged into the trust account, the one I had set up for Madison's future children. It had a balance of $200,000. I clicked on the tab labeled Beneficiaries. I highlighted Madison's name. I hit the backspace key. The name vanished. I typed in a new name, the Wounded Warrior Project. I clicked Confirm. The screen flashed green. Transaction successful. I closed the laptop. The sun had set. The room was dark. But for the first time in 15 years, I could see everything clearly. Tomorrow was Monday. The movers were coming. The locks were changing, and somewhere in a bar downtown, Gary was recording his own confession. Let the games begin. Tuesday morning arrived with the kind of deceptive sunshine that usually precedes a hurricane. The house was buzzing with a frantic energy that had nothing to do with joy and everything to do with vanity. Madison was pacing the kitchen, complaining about the dark circles under her eyes, claiming the stress of the wedding was ruining her complexion. Patricia was right behind her, nodding sympathetically, looking at me as if I were the cause of their fatigue. This was the moment, the final injection of anesthesia before the surgery. I pulled 2 envelopes from my jacket pocket. They were thick, heavy card stock, the kind that whispered luxury before you even opened them. I placed them on the marble island next to Madison's untouched green juice. "I think you both need a break," I said, keeping my voice warm and concerned. "You have been working so hard to make this wedding perfect. I booked you 2 nights at the Sanctuary Spa in the Berkers. The full package, massages, facials, mud baths. You leave in an hour." Madison froze. Her eyes went wide. She ripped open the envelope. "The Sanctuary. Robert, this place is impossible to get into. It costs like $2,000 a night." I smiled. I pulled some strings. "You need to be glowing for the photos on Saturday. Go. Relax. Do not worry about the house. Do not worry about the vendors. I will handle everything here." Patricia looked at me with tears welling in her eyes. Real tears for once. She came around the counter and hugged me. The smell of her expensive perfume bought with my bonus check last year filled my nose. "You are the best husband," she whispered. "I do not know what I would do without you. You will find out soon enough," I thought. "Go pack," I said gently, pulling away. "The car service will be here at 10. For the next hour, I watched them scramble. They packed as if they were going to Fashion Week, filling Louis Vuitton duffels with silk robes and designer swimwear. They were giddy. They were laughing. They were already mentally checking out of reality. At 10 and sharp, a black Lincoln Navigator pulled into the driveway. The driver loaded their bags. Madison blew me a kiss from the back seat. "Bye, Dad. You're the best." It was the first time in 10 years she had called me Dad without following it up with a request for money. It was also the last time she would ever say it. I waved until the car turned the corner and disappeared behind the hedgerow. The moment the taillights vanished, the smile dropped from my face like a heavy curtain. I turned back to the house. The silence was absolute. It was 10:05 a.m. I pulled out my phone and dialed the number for Titan Logistics. "You are clear to approach," I said. They must have been waiting around the block, because 3 minutes later, 2 massive 18-wheelers rolled up the driveway. These were not your average movers. These were white-glove relocation specialists, the kind used by museums and billionaires. They wore uniforms that were cleaner than Gary's best shirt. The foreman, a man named Miller, walked up to me with a tablet. "Mr. Sullivan," he said, "we have the inventory list. We are prioritizing high V-value assets and personal property." Correct, I said. I want to be very specific. If I bought it, it goes. If she bought it, or if it is cheap laminate, it stays. I want the contrast to be visible." Miller nodded. "We will have the ground floor cleared in 3 hours." I stood in the foyer and directed traffic. It was a surgical extraction. I watched them wrap the grand piano in protective padding. That piano cost $60,000. Patricia didn't play. She just used it to display framed photos of herself. "Take it," I said. They moved to the living room. The Persian rugs were rolled up, revealing the bare hardwood underneath. The EMS lounge chair, my favorite reading spot, was carried out. The 75-inch OLED television was unmounted from the wall, leaving a stark rectangular outline of dust where it had been. I walked into the kitchen. This was the hardest part, but also the most necessary. I opened the wine cellar. No, there were 300 bottles of vintage wine. Bordeaux Napa Cabernets, rare scotches. Gary had already put a dent in the collection, but the bulk of the value remained. "Pack it all," I ordered. "Leave the 2 bottles of grocery store Chardonnay on the bottom rack." "Why?" one of the movers asked, confused. "So they have something to drink when they realize their lives are over," I said. By 2 p.m., the house had undergone a transformation. It did not look like a home anymore. It looked like a warehouse that was going out of business. In the dining room, the solid mahogany table that seated 12 was gone. In its place, I left the folding card table Patricia had brought into the marriage 15 years ago. It sat there wobbly and scratched, looking pathetic in the center of the grand room. In the living room, the Italian leather sofas were in the truck. All that remained were a few velvet poufs Madison had bought from an online discount store, and a beanbag chair that smelled like dog. I went upstairs to the master bedroom. I stripped the bed, the Egyptian cotton sheets, the down comforter, the memory foam mattress, all mine, all paid for by the sweat of my 40-year career. I had the movers take the mattress. I left the box spring. It felt petty. But then I remembered the conversation I had overheard about putting me in the basement. Petty was just a matter of perspective. I went into the closet. My side was already empty. I looked at Patricia's side. Rows of designer dresses, shoes, handbags, tens of thousands of dollars in merchandise. I did not touch a thread of it. Let her keep her costumes. She would need them to maintain the illusion of wealth when she was standing in the unemployment line. The last thing to go was the art. The hallway had been lined with original oil paintings, landscapes of the coast that I had collected over decades. As the movers took them down, the walls looked naked. The hooks remained protruding from the plaster like small metal accusations. At 6 p.m., the trucks were full. The foreman handed me the tablet to sign. "We are heading to the storage facility in New Jersey," he said. "You are all set, Mr. Sullivan." I looked around the foyer. The echo was profound. My footsteps clicked loudly on the floor. The house felt cold, stripped of the insulation of wealth. It was just a structure now, a series of rooms connected by drywall and plumbing. I walked into the kitchen one last time. It was the only room with light, as I had instructed the electric company to cut the power to the rest of the house the next day. I placed the envelope on the counter, the one with the eviction notice and the cancellation receipts. I pulled up the single metal folding chair I had saved from the garage. I placed it facing the envelope. I sat down for a moment. I closed my eyes. I tried to feel guilt. I tried to feel sadness for the woman I had once loved, but all I could see was the text message on her phone to Gary laughing about my stupidity. All I could hear was Madison telling me I was just Robert. I stood up. I was not Robert the husband anymore. I was not Robert the stepdad. I was Robert the ghost. I walked out the back door, locking it behind me. I walked to the front door and keyed the code into the lockbox one last time. I dropped the heavy brass key inside. It made a metallic clink that sounded like a gavel hitting a block. Case closed. I got into my car. The sun was setting, casting long, dying shadows across the lawn. I did not look back at the empty windows. I put the car in drive and headed toward the airport. I had a one-way ticket to Tuscany in my pocket. They had 2 days of massages and cucumber water ahead of them. 2 days of bliss, and then they would come home to the nothingness they had created.